Hey there. As a philosopher, you're kind of in the business of thinking about thinking, right? You're interested in the structures of thought and how we use language to represent the world.
Absolutely. We're constantly grappling with concepts, dissecting arguments, and trying to build coherent systems of thought.
Right. So I think you're really going to appreciate this deep dive. Today, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty, the fundamental building blocks of logic, sentence connectives.
Ah, yes. The seemingly simple words like and, or, and not that we use every day, but which take on a whole new level of significance in formal logic.
Exactly. And we're taking our cues from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, well, wouldn't you know it, sentence connectives in formal logic.
A fantastic resource. It really unpacked how these everyday words are translated into the precise symbols and systems of logic. And it goes way beyond just defining them. It digs into their properties, their relationships, and the different ways they can function in various logical systems.
And that's what we're here for today, to get into the philosophical meat of it all. Not just what these connectives are, but what they tell us about the nature of truth, meaning, and the rules of rational thought.
Precisely. We're going to analyze the machinery, so to speak,
Hmm.
to understand how these connectives work, not just as isolated symbols, but as the very engines that drive logical inference.
I love that, the engines of logic. So first things first, how do we even begin to approach these seemingly simple yet profoundly important elements of logical thought?
Well, I think a helpful starting point, kind of a shift in perspective, is to think about formal languages a bit differently.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What do you mean?
Instead of viewing them just as static sets of symbols on a page, consider them as dynamic algebraic structures.
Okay, so it's less like a dictionary and more like a set of operations, like a toolbox.
Exactly. And those connectives, your and or not, those become the fundamental operations within these systems.
I'm starting to see the picture. So just as we have operations in arithmetic, like addition and subtraction, we have connectives in logic that actually do something.
Precisely. And just as arithmetic has rules about how those operations work together, so too does a formal language. We call that the consequence relation.
Yes. The consequence relation, that rule book that tells us what follows from what. It's essentially the framework for valid reasoning, right?
Absolutely. So we've got these basic operators, the connectives, and the system they operate within, governed by the consequence relation. But how do we connect this formal machinery to the concepts of truth and falsehood, which are so central to philosophy?
That's a great question. It seems like there's a bridge to be built between the manipulation of symbols and the truth or falsity of the statements they represent.
And that's where the idea of evaluation comes in.
Mm.
Essentially, evaluation is an assignment of a truth value, true or false, to each basic statement in our language, what we call atomic formulas.
So we're essentially laying down the groundwork, saying, in this particular scenario, this statement is true and this one's false.
Right, exactly. It's like setting the initial truth conditions for the simplest building blocks of our system.
Gotcha. So we're starting with these basic truth assignments. Now, how do those assignments get carried through to more complex statements, the ones that involve our connectives?
That leads us to the crucial concept of truth functionality. Basically, a connective is truth functional if the truth value of any complex statement built using that connective is entirely determined by the truth values of its parts, following a specific rule or function.
So it's kind of like a domino effect. If we know the truth values of the basic statements and we know the rules for the connective, we can automatically determine the truth value of the entire statement.
Exactly, it's a deterministic system. There's no ambiguity or room for contextual interpretation once those initial values are set.
So it sounds like truth functionality is this kind of ideal where everything flows neatly from the truth values of the basic components. But the entry also mentions pseudo-truth functionality. What's that about?
Well, that's a bit more nuanced. Pseudo-truth functionality allows for connectives that might behave truth functionally, but maybe only under specific conditions or with respect to certain types of valuations.
Okay, so it's a bit more flexible. It doesn't require this strict, always-on truth functional behavior.
Exactly. And then there's the notion of a connective being Boolean, which basically means it behaves just like its counterpart in classical logic, following those familiar truth tables we all know and love.
Right, the good old-fashioned and, or, and not behaving as expected. Now, the entry then shifts gears a bit and introduces something called sequence. How do those fit into the picture?
Sequence provide us with a different way to represent and analyze logical relationships. Specifically, they focus on the notion of logical consequence or inference.
Okay, I'm listening. How do they do that?
Well, A sequent, typically written as gamma phi, basically asserts that the formula phi logically follows from a set of formulas, gamma.
So it's like saying, if all these statements in gamma are true, then this other statement phi must also be true.
Precisely. It's a formal way to represent that flow of logical consequence. And the entry distinguishes between single conclusion sequence, where we derive a single formula, and multiple conclusion sequence, where we can have a set of formulas on the right side.
Ah, so multiple conclusion sequence are a bit more open-ended. It's not just one specific conclusion, but a range of possible consequences.
Exactly. It allows for more flexibility in representing certain kinds of logical relationships. Now, the entry then delves into this idea of generalized consequence relations, referencing Carnap in his work. What was he getting at?
Yeah, I remember that part. It seemed like there was some subtle issue he was trying to address with these standard consequence relations.
Right. Carnap recognized that even if you define a consequence relation based on all valuations that treat a certain connective, say negation, in a classical way, there might still be some valuations that are consistent with that consequence relation, but where the negation connective doesn't behave exactly as expected.
Oh, interesting. So even though the rules are meant to enforce a particular behavior, there might be loophole situations where the connective kind of slips through the cracks.
That's one way to think about it. It highlights this subtle gap between the rules of the system and the intended semantic interpretation. And generalized consequence relations were developed, in part, to try and bridge that gap, to ensure a tighter fit between the rules and the meaning.
So it's this ongoing effort to refine our logical tools, to make sure they are as precise and accurate as possible in capturing the concepts we're dealing with.
Exactly. Now, moving on, the discussion then shifts to proof systems and the rules that govern them. This is a crucial area for philosophy, especially for those interested in the foundations of knowledge and reasoning.
Right. It's all about how we justify our beliefs, how we build valid arguments and establish truths.
Exactly. And the entry highlights a view, going back to Gensen, that the very meaning of our logical vocabulary, those connectives we're exploring, is given by the rules that govern their use within a proof system.
So instead of defining and in terms of its truth table, we understand it by how it functions in proofs, how we can introduce and eliminate statements connected by and.
Precisely. The meaning is in the use, the logical moves that we can make. And the entry mentions sequent-to-sequent rules as a key part of these systems. They tell us how to move from one logical claim to another, constructing those chains of reasoning.
And then there's natural deduction, which we talked about earlier. I always found that approach to be a bit more intuitive. How does it compare to sequent calculus in terms of rules?
Well, natural deduction aims to mirror the way we reason informally. It's all about making assumptions, deriving conclusions from those assumptions, and then discharging those assumptions to arrive at our final conclusions.
Right, so it's like building up an argument step by step, keeping track of our assumptions along the way.
Exactly. And natural deduction uses introduction rules, which tell us how to introduce a connective into a derivation, and elimination rules, which tell us how to use a connective that's already there. Sequent calculus, on the other hand, always operates on these sequents, introducing connectives on either side of that consequence relation.
So they're two different approaches, but both ultimately aimed at formalizing the process of deduction. One focuses on the management of assumptions, the other on the structured manipulation of connectives within sequence. Now, the entry then raises this fascinating question about the existence and uniqueness of these connectives.
Ah, yes. That gets to the heart of some fundamental philosophical issues. The question of existence essentially asks, given a set of rules that define a connective, does that connective actually make sense? Is it coherent within the logical system?
Right, and I remember that cautionary tale about Tonk, that infamous hypothetical connective that wreaked havoc on logical systems.
Exactly. Tonk had these seemingly innocuous rules, but when combined, they allowed you to derive anything from anything.
Talk about a logical nightmare.
It was a disaster. And as the entry points out, Belknap's response was to emphasize the importance of conservativity. Adding a new connective shouldn't break the existing system. It shouldn't allow us to prove things that were previously unprovable.
So conservativity is like a safeguard. It ensures that our new connectives don't lead to logical chaos. But what about uniqueness? If we define a connective with certain rules, does that guarantee it's one of a kind?
That's the other key question. A set of rules uniquely characterizes a connective if, whenever you introduce a new connective with those exact same rules, they end up being essentially interchangeable.
So they're logically indistinguishable. You can swap them out in any context, and the meaning remains the same.
Precisely. And the entry notes that the standard connectives like conjunction, disjunction, and negation are generally uniquely characterized by their rules in both natural deduction and sequent calculus. It also delves into the connections between uniqueness and concepts like inductivity and cut inductivity, which are a bit more technical but relate to how these connectives behave within specific proof systems.
So it's all about ensuring our connectives are both well-behaved, meaning they don't break the system, and well-defined, meaning they have a clear and unique meaning. Now, the entry then introduces this idea of the subconnective relation. What's that all about?
The subconnective relation essentially asks, when is one connective weaker than another in terms of its logical power? When does one connective encompass the other?
Okay, so it's about the relative strength of different connectives, the range of valid inferences they allow.
Exactly. And one of the surprising results the entry highlights is that in classical logic, any two non-equivalent and fully defined connectives are actually incomparable with respect to this subconnective relation.
Really? That's counterintuitive. I would have thought there would be some sort of hierarchy, with some connectives being inherently stronger than others.
Yeah, it's not always what we might expect. However, in intuitionistic logic, it's a different story. There, non-equivalent connectives can have a proper subconnective relationship.
Huh. So the choice of logical system really does affect how these fundamental connectives relate to each other. It speaks to the deeper philosophical commitments underlying those systems. Now, we then encounter the concepts of extensionality and congruentiality. Those sound pretty important for any logical system that values clarity and consistency.
They are absolutely crucial. Congruentiality basically means that if two formulas are logically equivalent, they are truly interchangeable. You can swap them out in any context without messing up the logic.
So it's like they're synonyms in the strongest sense.
Exactly. And extensionality has to do with how well the behavior of our connectives lines up with the truth functional semantics of the logic.
Okay, so it's all about making sure our logical systems are well behaved, that truth and meaning are consistently tracked, and that substitution works as expected. Now, the entry then touches on hybrid connectives, which sounds pretty interesting.
Hybrid connectives are these attempts to create new connectives by combining features of existing ones. For example, you might try to define a connective that has properties of both conjunction and disjunction.
Oh, so like a hybrid and/or kind of thing.
Yeah.
What's the philosophical point of exploring those?
Part of it is to push the boundaries and see what's logically possible. Can we create new connectives that behave in coherent ways? And the key point is that these hybrid connectives might not be uniquely characterized by the properties we give them.
Ah, so you might have multiple connectives that satisfy the same hybrid conditions but differ in other subtle ways.
Precisely. It's like Yukasiewicz's analogy of the twins. You might not be able to tell them apart individually, but when you see them together, you realize they're distinct.
I love that analogy. It really gets at the heart of the philosophical challenge of defining things with limited properties. Now, the entry then goes into the specific challenges of extending intuitionistic logic with new connectives. Why is that so tricky?
Well, intuitionistic logic, with its constructive view of truth and proof, has these built-in constraints that make things a bit more delicate.
Okay, so it's a more sensitive system. You can't just throw in any new connective without potentially disrupting its core principles.
Exactly. The entry uses the example of trying to introduce a left inverse for intuitionistic negation and how it runs into trouble because of the law of triple negation. It shows how adding new connectives can lead to non-conservative extensions, where you can suddenly prove things that were previously unprovable.
So it's like intuitionistic logic is more resistant to arbitrary additions. You have to be very careful to preserve its core properties.
Precisely. And then we get to these concepts of special and universally representative connectives, which are all about analyzing the expressive power of different logics.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What makes a connective special or universally representative?
A universally representative connective is like a super versatile tool. You can essentially use it to define any other set of formulas within the system. It's a measure of how much you can express using that connective as a building block.
Wow, so it's like the ultimate logical Lego bark.
In a way, yes. A special connective, on the other hand, has this peculiar behavior where certain sequence involving that connective, which are normally unprovable, become provable when you substitute a formula of a particular class.
So it's like a special case, an exception to the general rules of inference.
Exactly. It can reveal something unique about the logical system, its limitations, or its distinctive features. And the entry points out that in classical logic, Every non-constant truth-functional connective is universally representative, but in intuitionistic logic, negation is special, but not universally representative.
That's fascinating. It shows how different logics have different expressive capabilities, different ways in which their connectives function. Now, the entry then touches on this distinction between diagonal and unrestricted equivalence, which is particularly relevant in modal logic.
Right. That distinction comes up when we're dealing with concepts like necessity and possibility, where truth is often relative to different possible worlds.
Okay, so it's about how truth might vary across different scenarios or hypothetical situations.
Precisely. Diagonal equivalence considers equivalence only in the actual world, while unrestricted equivalence demands equivalence across all possible worlds.
So, two statements might be considered equivalent in our everyday reasoning about the actual world, but they might have different truth values in other conceivable scenarios.
Exactly. And the entry connects this to Dummett's philosophical distinction between sameness of assertive content and sameness of ingredient sense, which is a way to analyze those subtle differences in meaning.
It's all about unpacking those layers of meaning, understanding how truth and equivalence might shift depending on the context. Now, finally, the entry circles back to the idea of truth functionality and presents this interesting counterexample involving disjunction.
Ah, yes. That's a great example that shows that even seemingly simple connectives can behave in unexpected ways. It uses a particular type of valuation to create a situation where P or P comes out true even when P itself is false.
Wait, how's that possible? P or P should just be equivalent to P, right?
You would think so. But this non-standard valuation, while still being consistent with classical logic, doesn't quite follow the usual truth-functional rules for disjunction.
So it's like we're pushing the boundaries of classical logic, finding these edge cases where things get a little bit weird.
Exactly, and it highlights the importance of carefully considering the semantic framework when we're analyzing these properties of connectives.
It's a reminder that there's always more to explore, even with the most basic concepts of logic.
Absolutely, it's a fascinating and ever-evolving field.
Well, this has been an incredibly enlightening deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the algebraic nature of connectives to their truth-functional properties, proof-theoretic characterizations, and the subtle questions of existence, uniqueness, and how they relate to each other.
It's been a real journey through the foundations of logic.
And for you, our philosophically inclined listener, I think this deep dive really underscores the importance of understanding these fundamental building blocks of thought. They're not just abstract symbols, but the very tools we use to reason, argue, and make sense of the world.
They shape how we think about truth, meaning, and the very nature of knowledge itself.
So as we wrap up, here's a final thought to ponder. Given the intricate machinery involved in analyzing even seemingly simple connectives, what does this tell us about the prospects and limitations of formalizing philosophical inquiry itself? Can we ever fully capture the nuances of philosophical concepts with the precision of formal logic, or will there always be a gap between the map and the territory?
That's a profound question indeed. And perhaps another question to consider is the ongoing tension between classical and intuitionistic logic regarding these fundamental connectives. Does this tension reveal deep philosophical differences about the nature of truth, proof, and meaning? And if so, what implications does that have for philosophical reasoning?
These are questions that go to the heart of what it means to be a philosopher, and we encourage you to continue exploring, to delve deeper into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry and the wealth of resources it offers. This deep dive has only scratched the surface. There's a whole universe of logical and philosophical insights waiting to be discovered.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep pushing the boundaries of thought.
And until next time, happy philosophizing.
Indeed.